Shoma, are you in bed with another man right now?
No. Baby, that is not what this is.
23 nights, 2 hours, every single midnight. I've been lying in that bed counting every minute you don't come back to me.
Legacy, I am not ready.
Whatever is behind this door cannot be worse than what I've been imagining in the dark.
I thought I knew everything about my wife. 8 years of marriage, same house on Glenwood Avenue in Decatur, Georgia. Same creaking floorboard outside our bedroom door that I'd been meaning to fix since Obama's second term. I thought I knew her the way you know a place you've lived in so long you stop really looking at it. I was wrong. For 23 nights, my wife, Chioma Darian, slipped out of our bed at exactly midnight. Not 11:58, not 12:02. Midnight every time, like something she had scheduled. And every time, she came back 2 hours later smelling like turpentine and a secret I didn't have a name for yet. Now here is what you don't know yet. What was happening inside that garage was not what I feared. It was something so much larger. Something that was going to change not just our marriage, but the next generation of my family, in ways I could not have predicted if I had tried. And when I finally learned the truth, I stood in that room feeling like a man who had been handed a gift he didn't know he'd been waiting his whole life to receive. My name is Legacy Darian. I'm 36 years old. I run a small construction contracting business out of Metro Atlanta, mostly residential builds and Beltline corridor work. My hands are calloused. My boots have mortar on them. I am not, by any honest measure, a complicated man. But Chioma, 33, warm caramel skin, long locks that fall just past her shoulders, a laugh that fills whatever room it walks into. Chioma has always been the complicated one. The beautiful kind of complicated. The kind that keeps you paying attention for 8 years and still leaves you wondering if you've gotten to the bottom of her yet. She worked in marketing for a firm up in Buckhead. Good salary, good benefits, sensible. Her mother, Yetunde, had made sure of that. Yetunde was 62 years old, sharp and certain in the way of a woman who had steered her children through a world she didn't fully trust to be fair to them. Sensible job, steady income, no foolishness. Chioma had followed that road her whole adult life. I thought she was at peace with it. I had stopped asking. The night it started, I came home late off a job site on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard. Poured myself some water, sat on the edge of the bed. It was past 11. Chioma was already under the covers, facing the window, breathing slow and even. I was asleep in 3 minutes. I woke up at 2:14 in the morning to an empty bed. I told myself she'd gone down for chamomile tea. We keep it on the second shelf of the pantry, right next to the church cookbook her Aunt Deborah gave us as a wedding gift. I told myself that's exactly where she was. I lay there another 15 minutes. She didn't come back. When I finally went downstairs, every light in the house was dark, except for a thin strip of yellow seeping out from under the garage door. And from behind it, barely audible, came a sound I hadn't expected at all. Old gospel music. The quiet, worn, smooth kind that Chioma's mother used to hum while she cooked. And beneath the music, something softer, something that pulled the air straight out of my chest. She was crying. I stood on those cold hardwood floors in my socks and did not move for a long time. A man's mind goes to dark places at 2 in the morning, when he finds his wife locked in a garage, weeping. I ran through every worst-case scenario, like flipping through channels on a television I couldn't turn off. Was she talking to someone? Was she planning to leave? Had I missed something, some shift in her that I should have caught weeks ago? That was the first night. I went back to bed without knocking. I told myself I would ask her in the morning. The next morning, I asked. She was at the kitchen counter pouring coffee, still in her robe. She looked up and said she'd had trouble sleeping and gone down for tea. She said it so easily, so naturally, that I almost believed her. Almost. But the lock on the garage door was new, and tea does not take 2 hours. I had installed that deadbolt myself 1 month earlier when Chioma said she wanted better security. I'd done it the same afternoon she asked, proud of myself for handling it quickly. I fix things. It's what I do. I didn't know I had just locked myself out of the most important room in my own house. And so I did what men sometimes do when they love someone and don't yet know how to ask the right question. I let it go. I went to work. I came home. I watched her laugh at dinner and wash the dishes after, and I told myself, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm looking for something that isn't there. I chose to believe that because it was easier, because I wanted to. 3 weeks later, I was no longer able to choose that. 23 nights, 2 hours each time, the same gospel music drifting up through the floor, the same quiet when she came back to bed, her arm sliding around me from behind, her breath evening out while I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, asking myself the one question I couldn't stop turning over in the dark. How long has the woman I love been carrying something she can't tell me? And then, 1 week before I finally knocked, I noticed something else. Chioma's phone was face down on the kitchen counter. For just a second before she picked it up, the screen lit with a preview notification from someone called Chi, her older sister, Chiamaka. I only caught a fragment of the message. You should just submit it already. Stop waiting for the perfect... Chioma had the phone in her hand before I could read more. She didn't mention it. Neither did I. I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind and forgot about it. I would not forget about it again for a long time. Don't go anywhere, because the night I finally knocked on that garage door is the night everything I thought I understood about my marriage began to come apart, and then slowly, miraculously, come back together in a shape I never could have imagined. I called Jameer True the next morning. Jameer has been my closest friend since our days at Clark Atlanta. Broad-shouldered, bald by choice, the kind of man who genuinely cannot understand why anyone would sit with a problem when you could just walk straight at it. I told him everything. The midnight trips, the locked door, the gospel music, the crying I couldn't stop hearing, the tea that didn't take 2 hours. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for 3 full seconds. Legacy, you need to talk to her. Tonight. I can't, I said. Why not? I thought about it. Because if I'm wrong about what I think it is, if this is something completely different, I don't want to be the man who accused her of something she didn't do. Jameer made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. And if you're right? I didn't answer. We both already knew I didn't have one. I'm a contractor. When something doesn't add up on a job site, I go back to the materials. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea, going warm beside me, and pulled up our joint account on my phone. What I found was nothing like what I'd been bracing for. No hotels, no unfamiliar restaurants, no gas stations in neighborhoods she had no reason to be in. What I found instead were charges from art supply stores, Michael's on Ponce de Leon Avenue, and a specialty shop called Artist and Craftsman Supply up in Midtown. Canvases, acrylic paint, primer, brushes. Larger amounts, bought faster over the last 2 months. Here's the thing. Chioma had always kept her own card for personal spending. We'd agreed on that early in our marriage. A small piece of independence we each maintained, no questions asked. For most of the past 8 months, whatever she'd been buying had stayed quietly on her own account. Only recently, as she'd been pushing towards some kind of finish line, had the spending crossed over onto ours. Her personal card had hit its limit. She was racing to complete something, and she was running out of room to hide the cost of it. I stared at those line items for a long time. Art supplies. Not another man, not a lawyer. Art supplies. Bought over 2 months with the urgency of someone trying to finish something before a deadline only they knew about. Chioma had studied art. I knew that in the vague way you know something a person mentioned once and tucked away. Never followed up, never fully examined. She had never said, "I used to paint," or "I miss it." That part of herself had been folded up small and stored somewhere I hadn't thought to look. And I, building things with my hands every single day, had somehow never thought to ask what my own wife might be building inside herself. I called Yetunde, Chioma's mother, the next afternoon. Somewhere in the conversation, I let slip that Chioma had been asking about my father's old woodworking tools. Yetunde went quiet. Then, "Legacy. Did you know Chioma used to draw everything when she was small? I mean, everything. The walls, her homework papers, the brown paper bags I'd bring home from the grocery store. I had to buy her sketchbooks just to protect the furniture." A pause. I told her to stop when she was 17. Told her it was beautiful, but that black women who want security don't follow paintbrushes. Told her the world wouldn't hold her the way a steady job would. Her voice went somewhere quieter. I thought about that conversation a great deal since then. That sentence landed somewhere I hadn't expected. Not just about Chioma, but about all the things people are quietly told to put down before they ever get to find out what they were meant to carry. She asked me about the coping saw and the belt sander, Yetunde added. Said she needed them for a project. I assumed she was helping you on a job. I thanked her. I hung up. I moved on to what came next. That same night, I picked up the shared tablet we kept on the kitchen counter, mostly used for recipes and utility bills, something neither of us opened very often. I was reaching for the calculator app when the Photos icon caught my eye. It had synced something new, a folder I didn't recognize. Project Hope. 63 images. She hadn't noticed it had automatically backed up from her phone to the tablet she only used in the garage, a device I'd had no reason to open in months. I scrolled through slowly. Early sketches, color studies, reference photographs, measurement grids written in Chioma's careful handwriting, notes that read like architectural plans, cadmium gold for the sky, alizarin at the edges, gesso, 3 coats minimum. And on one page, in the same script I recognized from 8 years of grocery lists and birthday cards left on my pillow, a single line that nearly stopped me cold. Anniversary gift. For him and for what we lost. 8 years. I will finish this. She had been planning this for 8 months, not impulsively, not out of loneliness, because she had made herself a promise, and she intended to keep it. I set the tablet down on the table. I sat there in the quiet kitchen for a long time, the house completely still around me, the faint gospel music already drifting up from below. She was down there right now. She was down there most nights, and for the first time in 3 weeks, the fear that had been sitting on my chest began to shift into something different. Not relief, not yet. Something closer to grief, for the loss she had been carrying so carefully and so quietly that I hadn't understood how deep it went. Jameer called again the next morning. Did you confront her? I told him what I'd found on the tablet. He went quiet in a different way than usual. Not his impatient quiet, but something more careful. When he spoke, his voice had dropped half a register. Legacy. You don't need to confront anybody. You need to go to your wife. Tonight. Not because you're suspicious, because she has been carrying something heavy all by herself, and she shouldn't have to anymore. He was right. I had been so focused on what I was afraid of finding that I had nearly missed what was actually there. That night, I went downstairs. I stood outside the garage door with my hand raised. I knocked. Stay with me, because what I saw on the other side of that door was not an affair. It was not a secret phone. It was not another man. What it was, I still don't have the right word for. The closest I can get is a prophecy. And it was painted on our wall. I knocked once. Soft. Just my knuckles against the wood, not a demand. More like a question I'd been holding for 3 weeks and couldn't keep inside any longer. The gospel music stopped immediately. The silence that replaced it felt enormous, the kind of silence that has weight. I heard her footsteps cross the concrete floor, slow and deliberate, and then stop right on the other side of the door. A long breath. Then her voice, barely above a whisper. Legacy? It's me. She didn't answer for a moment. Then, you're supposed to be asleep. There are things a man can say at a moment like that. He can get loud. He can list every sleepless night like evidence he's been collecting. I'd rehearsed several versions of that in my head during long drives home from job sites. None of it felt right, standing there in the dark hallway with cold hardwood under my feet. Chioma, I said, are you seeing someone else? A silence so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. No, she said finally. Her voice broke clean on the word. No, baby, that is not what this is. Then open the door. I'm not ready, Chioma. My voice came out quieter than I intended, raw in a way I hadn't planned. I've been lying awake in that bed for 3 weeks. Whatever is on the other side of this door cannot be worse than what I've been imagining. Silence, long enough that I stopped waiting for a response. I sat down on the hallway floor, back against the door. I don't know exactly what made me do it. Instinct, maybe. Or just the feeling that if she could hear, I wasn't going anywhere, wasn't demanding, wasn't angry, just there. Then maybe the door would open on its own terms. I heard her sit down on the other side. The two of us, separated by 2 inches of wood and 8 months of silence. We stayed like that for close to 2 minutes. I counted. Then I heard the bolt slide back. The garage smelled like linseed oil and acrylic paint, and something earthier underneath. Sawdust and wood finish from my father's old tools, arranged along one wall with a care that told me they had been handled regularly, respectfully. A single work lamp on an extension cord threw warm light across the far wall. I stopped walking. I don't know exactly when. Somewhere between the doorway and the middle of the garage, my feet just stopped. Covering nearly that entire far wall, close to 6 feet tall and 8 feet wide, was a painting. Not a sketch, not a study, a painting. Our house, our home on Glenwood Avenue, but rendered into something else entirely. The sky above it was deep violet, edged in burnished gold. The old oak tree in the front yard was painted silver blue. The structure of the house itself was outlined in warm amber, its edges dissolving into sweeping brushstrokes that looked less like architecture and more like energy, like the building was radiating something outward into the world. And in the center foreground, 2 figures, made not from careful lines, but from long arcs of color, as if the painter had tried to capture not what we looked like, but what we felt like. I knew immediately those 2 figures were us. My wife stood beside me, with her arms wrapped around herself, watching my face. She was wearing paint-stained leggings and one of my old work shirts, her locks pinned up with a pencil. Her eyes were the eyes of someone waiting on a verdict they can't predict and can't control. How long? I asked. 8 months of planning, she said quietly. the last 3 weeks actually doing it. I wanted to finish it before our anniversary. I turned and looked at her. Really looked at her. Why couldn't you just tell me? And then she stopped holding herself together. She sat down on the paint-spattered stool in the middle of the garage and put her face in her hands. And she cried. Not the careful, controlled kind, but the full, exhausted kind that comes from carrying something alone for far too long. Because I buried this part of myself when I was 18 years old, she said. My mother told me that dreaming about paintbrushes was a luxury I couldn't afford, and I believed her. I got the degree, I got the job, I built the life she said would keep me safe. She looked up at me, her hazel eyes red at the edges. And then 2 years ago, when I lost the baby, Legacy, when I lost her, I didn't know how to survive it. I didn't know how to tell you how bad it really was. You were grieving too, and I thought I had to hold it together for both of us. So I started drawing again. In notebooks at first, then bigger. It was the only thing that made me feel like I still existed. I crossed the garage in 3 steps and held her. I held her the way you hold something you almost lost without realizing you were loosening your grip. You don't have to be strong alone, I said into the top of her head. That is not what I married you for. She cried harder. The good kind. The kind that means something is finally letting go. I stood there holding her, and I thought about all the nights I had lain awake on the wrong side of that locked door, telling myself the worst stories I could imagine, and how none of them had come close to the truth. The truth was not betrayal. The truth was a woman who had been grieving so carefully, so quietly, for so long, that she had learned to grieve in secret. The truth was that she had built something extraordinary out of the worst year of our lives, and she hadn't known how to hand it to me because she hadn't been sure I would know what it was. And I understood that, not as an excuse, but as a mirror. Because I had not always known how to receive something I couldn't fix with my hands. I had not always known how to just sit with the weight of something and let it be what it was. We had both been doing the best we knew how to do, and the best we knew had left us alone, on opposite sides of the same grief, for 2 years. I held her tighter. I didn't say any of that out loud. Some things are better understood than spoken. We were still holding each other when her phone buzzed on the workbench. She pulled back and glanced at the screen. Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, but a startled alertness, like someone caught mid-sentence. She silenced the call. I saw the name. Chiamaka. Her older sister. The same Chi whose message preview I had glimpsed on the kitchen counter a week ago. I caught a half-second of voicemail before she pressed the phone face down. You submitted the gallery application, and they are going to respond by Friday. Does Legacy know yet about the studio plan and the solo show and... She cut it off. Her eyes came up to meet mine. The painting was one truth. The voicemail told me there was at least one more she hadn't gotten to yet. I could see it in the way she held her breath, waiting to see what I would do with what I'd just heard. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back with the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they'd been building the courage to step off of. Not afraid of falling, but not quite ready to release the ledge. 1 week, I said quietly. You said 2 weeks a month ago, and I gave it to you. I'll give you 1 more. But after that, no more closed doors. Not between us. She exhaled, long and shaky, like something had finally been given permission to leave her body. 1 week. I promise. She reached up and held my face with both hands, paint still on her fingers, and looked at me with those hazel eyes I had spent 8 years learning to read. I love you, more than I know how to say out loud. I know, I said. I love you too. Now come upstairs. I turned off the work lamp. We walked back upstairs together, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I slept, deep and still, without the weight of not knowing pressing down on my chest all night long. Stay with me, because in exactly 7 days, Chioma was going to take me back into that garage. And what I found on that wall was going to shake me in a way I never saw coming. Not because of what had been added, but because of what had been there from the very beginning. She came for me on a Saturday morning, our 8th wedding anniversary. She was wearing a yellow dress, the kind she reserves for days she has decided matter, and she set a mug of coffee in front of me at the kitchen table without a word. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, exactly right. Then she held out her hand. "Come with me," she said. We went downstairs. She unlocked the garage. Then she paused, removed the key from the lock, and placed it in my open palm. She didn't explain the gesture. She didn't need to. I understood. No more closed doors. She pushed it open. The painting was finished, and finished was something entirely different from what I had seen in progress 1 week before. New layers had emerged that hadn't been visible in the lamplight of that first night. Depths that only revealed themselves as I stepped closer and let my eyes settle and take their time. The texture of our front walk on Glenwood. The specific lean of the old oak. The exact curve of the porch railing I had repaired the summer we moved in. Details that could only have been painted by someone who had looked at this house 10,000 times and quietly memorized every last thing that made it hers. And then I saw something I had not seen before. In the upper right corner, set slightly back from the 2 central figures, small enough that you could walk past them without noticing, were 3 small silhouettes. Children. Tiny. Holding hands with each other, reaching toward the 2 larger figures. Reaching toward us. They were painted in the same sweeping, energetic style as everything else. Color in motion, not careful lines. They looked as though they had always been part of the composition, as though they had been there from the very first brushstroke. I stared at them for a long time without speaking. "Who are they?" I asked. My wife was quiet. Then, "I honestly don't know. I just felt like our family wasn't quite complete yet. I painted what I felt, not what I knew." She looked at that corner of the canvas the way you look at something that surprised you by revealing its own meaning. "I didn't plan them. They were just there when I stepped back." I sat down on the garage floor. I don't know why. My legs just went. I looked at the painting from down there, from a lower angle, the way a child looks at something bigger than they are. The 3 small silhouettes were even more visible from the floor. Tiny, reaching upward, holding each other. I didn't have a word for what I was feeling. It wasn't logic. It was something older than logic. The kind of knowing that lives in the body before the mind can catch up to it. I sat with it for a moment. I let it be what it was. Then I stood up and we went inside, and I told myself it was just a painting. I was wrong about that, too. That same evening, after a quiet dinner, Chioma found me on the back porch. The July night in Atlanta was warm in that patient, settled way, the kind of warmth that wraps around your shoulders without asking. She sat down beside me, and for a while we just watched the yard go still. She was turning something over in her hand, face down against her leg, the way she turns things in her mind when the words haven't arrived yet. Then she set it on the arm of my chair. A pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. I looked up at her. Her eyes were already wet. The uncertain kind of tears, the kind that don't yet know what they are. "I just found out yesterday," she said. "Legacy, I am so happy and I am so afraid. Because of last time. I cannot go through losing another one the way I did before. Quietly, alone, holding everything together so no one would see me break." "You won't," I said. I took both her hands in mine. "I'm here. Whatever comes next, we go through it together. That is the deal. That has always been the deal." She leaned into me. I put my arm around her shoulders, and we stayed there until the fireflies started rising out of the grass, and the sky had gone from orange to deep blue to something that had no name. 8 weeks later, we drove to the imaging center on Memorial Drive for the first ultrasound. The technician was efficient and calm, her face professionally neutral as she moved the transducer in slow, deliberate circles. Then she stopped. She looked at the screen. She looked at Chioma. She looked at me. "Congratulations to both of you. I'm counting 3 heartbeats." The room went very quiet. On the screen, 3 small pulses. Steady, certain, already here. Chioma grabbed my hand hard enough that I felt my knuckles press together. I'm fairly certain I made a sound. I am less certain it was a word. Triplets. 3 boys, as we would learn at a later appointment. 3 sons coming into the house on Glenwood Avenue. The same house painted in violet and gold. The same house where my wife had spent 23 midnights quietly healing herself in the dark. The painting had shown us 3 children before either of us knew 3 were coming. That night, after Chioma had fallen into the deepest, most relieved sleep I had seen from her in 2 years, I went back downstairs alone. I stood in front of the painting with my phone's flashlight and looked at it the way you look at something you suddenly realize you haven't been reading carefully enough. I moved the beam slowly across the lower left section. The wedding vignette she had painted there, the small white church on Flat Shoals Road where we had married 8 years ago. And there, folded into that scene so precisely it was nearly invisible under ambient light, only emerging when the beam hit it at exactly the right angle, was the unmistakable shape of an ultrasound image. Rendered in brushstrokes so careful, so deliberate, that there was no mistaking what it was. The ultrasound from 2 years ago. The loss. She had painted it in the exact tones of the surrounding background, a ghost image, present but not announced. You had to shine a direct light at that specific corner to see it lift off the canvas. I don't think she put it there to be found easily. I think she painted it the way you keep something you're not ready to let go of, but can no longer carry in secret. Close enough to find when the time was right. She had placed her deepest grief inside the painting, not hidden away, not erased, included. Woven into the beginning of our family, as if to say, this belongs here too. This is part of our story. This one does not get left out. I stood in the garage for a long time with the flashlight on that corner. I thought about the child we had lost, and the way Chioma had grieved in silence because she was trying to be strong, and the way I had let her because I hadn't known how to ask. I thought about what it meant that she had found a way to hold that loss without burying it, to include it in the portrait of our family rather than store it separately in the dark. I thought about the 3 small silhouettes in the upper right corner, how they had appeared before either of us knew they were coming, summoned not by knowledge, but by feeling. And I thought about what that meant, that some part of my wife had known, or hoped, or believed deeply enough that believing and knowing were no longer different things. She had painted a future she could not yet see. She had held space for children who had not yet arrived, the same way she had held space for a child who had already gone. The painting contained both at once, the grief and the hope, the loss and the promise, held together in the same frame, the same brushstrokes, the same wall. That is what she had been building at midnight, not just a painting, a place where everything we had been through could exist together without any of it being erased. I turned off the flashlight. I stood in the quiet for a moment. Then I whispered to the painting, to all of it, to the 3 small silhouettes in the corner who had known before we did. You were right. Don't go yet, because how Legacy and Chioma built what came next is a story about the kind of love that doesn't just survive hard seasons. It gets built from them, 3 boys. We named them Chosen Darian, True Darian, and Legacy Darian Jr. Chioma calls the youngest one Little L to keep the household from descending into a full identity crisis every time someone says my name across the room, which is a practical solution, and I have come to appreciate it greatly. They arrived at 34 weeks, small and urgent, and completely certain they were ready for the world. Chioma was extraordinary through all of it, which is to say, she was frightened and honest about being frightened. And I have come to understand that is a far higher form of strength than pretending you're not. We got through it together. That, at long last, was the whole point. The first months home were a beautiful and sleep-deprived chaos. 3 babies in a Decatur house built for 2 adults and occasional visits from Yetunde. Our neighbors, Miss Clara and her husband Raymond, from 3 houses down on Glenwood, brought casseroles over every other Tuesday for the first 8 weeks without ever being asked. I don't know what was in those casseroles, but they tasted unmistakably like being cared for by people who had already been through the hard part and were quietly rooting for you from the other side of it. While Chioma was still in her 3rd trimester, I began converting the garage. Not back into a garage, forward into something it had already become on its own. I widened the rear wall to bring in more natural light. I refinished the floors. I built the storage shelving using my father's coping saw and his old workbench, and I remember running my hand along the surface of that bench the morning I first set it up in the new space, thinking about the fact that his hands had been on it before mine, and that someday my son's hands might be on it after me. Some things matter in ways that don't need to be explained out loud. Chioma came down one afternoon to check on the progress, 7 months along, moving carefully down the stairs. She stood in the doorway and looked at what the room had become. She was quiet for nearly a full minute. Then, Legacy, you built me a room. I built you a studio, I said. There's a difference. She laughed. That full, yard-filling laugh, and it echoed off the new high ceiling, and it was the best sound that garage had ever made. 3 months after the boys came home, Chioma gave notice at her marketing firm in Buckhead. She began painting full-time and opened a small weekend art class for children in the neighborhood, mostly kids from Decatur and East Point whose parents, like her own mother once had, were quietly steering them towards something practical and away from anything that looked too much like a dream. She charged what families could manage, which was sometimes not very much. She didn't mind. She said the point was never the money. The point was that no child in her orbit was going to be told that what they made with their hands and their imagination was beautiful, but not useful. Not while she had anything to say about it. I watched her teach sometimes, from the doorway. The same doorway where I had stood the night I first knocked, when the door was locked and the music was low, and I didn't know yet what was on the other side of it. She would move between the small easels set up along the studio wall, leaning down to see each child's work at their eye level rather than hers, asking what they were trying to make instead of telling them what she saw. She spoke to those children the way someone speaks when they know exactly what it costs to be told that what you love is not practical. She was careful with them, in the way you are careful with something you understand from the inside. Yetunde came to help with the boys during the first month home. She and Chioma spent a long afternoon together on the back porch the second week, just the 2 of them. I could hear the murmur of their voices through the screen door, but not the words, and I made no effort to hear them. Whatever passed between them that afternoon was theirs entirely. What I noticed in the weeks that followed was that Yetunde started coming by on Saturday mornings and sitting in the open studio doorway, watching her daughter work. Quiet, attentive. watching Chioma the way she might have watched her as a small girl, if she had ever let herself. That was its own kind of reckoning. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to. One afternoon, clearing a corner of the studio to make room for a second easel, I moved a section of old wall paneling. An envelope was taped to the back of it, carefully, deliberately, sealed with painter's tape folded twice at each corner, the way someone secures something they intend to stay put. On the front, written in thick black marker in Chioma's handwriting, "For the man who builds things." Not hidden carelessly, hidden for me, in the one place she knew I would eventually reach with my own hands, building something for her. She had known I would one day tear into these walls to make the studio. She had planned around it. She had left me a letter inside the wall of the room she didn't yet know I was going to build her, and she had addressed it to the exact version of me she was counting on to find it. I stood there for a long time before I opened it. Most of what was inside was private, between her and whatever she had been trying to hold on to in the worst week of our marriage. But the last line read, "If I ever find my way back to making something beautiful, I will make it for us. For what we had, and for what we still might have. I promise." The date in the corner was the week we lost the baby. 2 years ago. She had hidden a promise to both of us inside the wall of the room that would one day hold everything she had come back to. Some promises take root in us before we even know we've made them. I sat down on the studio floor and held that letter. Chioma came and sat beside me. We didn't talk much. The room was warm and quiet, the afternoon light coming through the window I had widened with my own hands. And from upstairs, we could hear the soft sounds of 3 boys beginning to stir. We didn't need to say anything. We already understood what it meant. The painting hangs in our living room now. The great violet and gold canvas with the 3 small silhouettes in the upper right corner. Our sons stop and look at it sometimes, the way young children look at things they seem to recognize before they have words for why. Chosen pointed at it once and made a sound in the private language he and his brothers share, and both True and Little Elle turned to look, as if they understood something about that painting the rest of us are still working out. Stay with me just a little longer, because what happened on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon in that studio and one quiet moment in a parking lot afterward is the part of this story I most want to make sure you don't miss. There is a particular Tuesday afternoon I keep returning to. The boys were about 4 months old. Chioma was in the studio. The door was open, which was new, which still did something small and grateful inside my chest every single time I noticed it. Little Elle had just gone down for a nap. Chosen and True were in the living room in the pack and play, doing that thing very young babies do, where they stare at a fixed point on the ceiling, as though receiving important information from somewhere the rest of us are not cleared to access. I carried 2 mugs of coffee to the studio doorway and stood there a moment without announcing myself. She had music on, still gospel, still the old warm kind, but the door was open now, the sound flowing freely down the hall and up the stairs. She was standing at the large easel with her locks pinned back, paint on her left forearm, working on a new canvas. 3 small faces, barely formed yet, the boys. It takes a particular kind of faith to paint someone's face before you fully know it. You have to paint what you feel before you can see what you'll find. She heard me and looked over her shoulder. Her face did what it does now when she sees me, open, unguarded, the way a face looks when it no longer has anything to protect. She reached for the coffee without a word. I leaned in the doorway. We were quiet together in the warm afternoon light coming through the window I had widened with my own 2 hands. That is the moment I hold on to. That quiet, that open door. The Atlanta Black Art Collective accepted her application. Her first solo exhibition opened at their gallery on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard. The same street where I had been finishing a job the night all of this began. The night I first noticed the light under the garage door and heard the old gospel music and stood in the dark hallway, not knowing what to do with what I was feeling. 83 pieces. The large painting from the garage was the centerpiece, mounted at the far end of the room so that you saw it the moment you walked in, but had to travel the full length of the gallery to reach it. Past everything else she had made, past the smaller studies, the neighborhood children's portraits from her weekend class, the pieces that told the story of how a woman comes back to herself. By the time you arrived in front of it, you understood why it had to be last. It was the thing everything else had been moving toward. Yetunde came to the opening in her pearl necklace and her best church blouse. I watched from across the gallery as she found the painting. I saw the moment it reached her, the slow intake of breath, the way her hand came up to rest against her collarbone, just holding herself still for a moment while something moved through her. Then she walked across the room. She didn't go to Chioma first. She came to me. She put both her hands around my one hand, the way older women do when they mean something too large for ordinary words. And she looked straight at me and said quietly, "Thank you for giving her the room I took away." That was all. She held my hand for one more moment. Then she released it and went to find her daughter. I watched her cross the gallery and put her arm around Chioma's shoulders from behind. The way you reach for someone when you have finally stopped being afraid to. I had to look away. Some things are too private to witness fully, even when you love the people in them. Chiamaka stood beside me a little later during the opening and said, "You know, she almost didn't submit the application. She talked herself out of it 3 times. She looked at me sideways. She said you gave her the room, not just the studio, the room in the marriage, to finally be something she'd been too afraid to be. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just looked across the gallery at my wife, standing in front of the painting she had made in secret at midnight, in the room I had unwittingly locked her into, surrounded by people who could now see what she had been building alone in the dark. And I held that image with both hands, the way you hold something you know you'll want to remember clearly for the rest of your life. Before we left, I stood in front of the painting one last time. The gallery was thinning out, the lights warm and low. I looked at the 2 figures made of color and motion, not careful lines, but feeling made visible. And I looked at the 3 small silhouettes above them, and I thought about the letter folded inside the wall, about the promise Chioma made to herself in the worst week of our marriage, 2 years before any of this, that she would find her way back to making something beautiful, for both of them, no matter how long it took. She kept it. She more than kept it. In the parking lot afterward, Chioma slipped her hand into mine as we walked to the car. We were almost there when she stopped walking and looked up at me in the dark. "I'm glad you knocked," she said. I looked at her for a moment, at the yellow light of the parking lot on her face, at the locks falling loose around her shoulders, at the paint she'd missed on the back of her left hand, even after washing up. "I almost didn't," I said. She squeezed my hand. We got in the car and went home to our sons. This story reminds us that the people we love most are sometimes hurting in rooms we never thought to knock on. Think of someone in your life who has gone a little quiet lately. Not dramatically, just quieter than usual. Maybe a daughter who stopped calling on Sunday mornings. A granddaughter who says, "I'm fine," too quickly. A neighbor whose porch light stays off now when it never used to. This week, don't wait for them to come to you. Show up at their door with something small. A container of soup, a cutting from your garden, that paperback you already finished. Don't ask if they're okay. Just say, "I was thinking about you. I had a few minutes. Can I sit with you a while?" Legacy didn't fix Chioma's pain. He just knocked and sat down on the floor and waited. Sometimes that is everything. These are authentic human stories shaped by real pain and real dreams. AI helped with grammar, flow, and structure, but the heart, the moral weight, and the life-changing lessons belong entirely to the human creators and their audience. Production team: Story and Screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.